This podcast may contain explicit language. Welcome to the Greatest Movie of All Time podcast, the show that uses a unique grading style to redefine what the greatest movies are. I'm Tom Duncan.
And I'm Dana Duncan.
Tonight we apply our patent-pending Stanley rubric to Three Idiots, starring Aamir Khan, R. Madhavan, and Sharman Joshi. However, quickly before we get to the show, next week we will be covering the mid-2000s comedy hit Wedding Crashers, starring Owen Wilson, Vince Vaughn, Rachel McAdams, and Ela Fisher. You won't want to miss that one, so check out realgood.com or the Real Good app to find where it's streaming for you. That's ReelGood. Also, you can still sign up for our weekly newsletter either by the website in the show notes. You can subscribe at the bottom of every page, or you can also email us at greatestaltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. And, as always, please like, follow, rate, and review the show on whichever podcast platform you use. With that, we welcome a new guest to the show, friend of mine, TikTok and Instagram star, Saloni, Nahar. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So, as we do with all of our first-time guests, we're going to put you through the hot seat, as it were, and ask you a couple of just quick questions, let the audience familiarize itself with you. So, first up on our list, as always, tell us a little bit about yourself and why you love movies.
Yeah, I think movies have the power to make people feel so many different ways. I think you can be having a really bad day and then watch a movie and feel like, wow, I can really take on the world and change my life. And it really just comes down to storytelling, visual storytelling, and how, as humans, we can understand each other better and learn from each other through stories. And sometimes movies is the best way to convey that.
Yeah, it certainly is sometimes. So then, what is your favorite movie and why?
I have a few. Today is one of my favorites we're reviewing today, so I'm going to pause on that one. But another one of my favorite movies is Hidden Figures, and it's because it is not only based on a true story, but again, I think there's a lot of powerful moments in that film that just teach us a lot about the human experience and overcoming adversity and like women's history, Black women's history in the United States.
I think you and my mother and my sister would all bond very well over that movie. I remember walking out of the theater and them just absolutely adoring that movie. So then finally, what makes a good movie to you?
I think a good movie has strong characters that sometimes if character development is nice, but if not character development, just something that makes you feel something. Like you watch the movie and you're taking something away. It's not like, wow, I just spent 2 hours and didn't really get anything. So just like a message that's able to come across.
Let's dive into the movie then. Just first up, Saloni, you suggested this to me about 2 months ago, I believe. And I invited you on the show to talk about it. What is it about Three Idiots that makes you want to go to bat for it?
I think it's a film that has a lot of lessons and there's a lot of powerful moments. It's not just like one climax. I feel like there's a lot of big events in this movie. And I also think it can make you cry if you cry during movies, but it could also make you laugh and feel good. And I think it does a really good job tying it all together at the end. Like they had a lot of seeds in the beginning and then like they just have repetitive things that keep coming back and they spend so much time on each character's storyline that you really feel by the end of the film like, wow, like I like went to college with these guys and they grew so much.
Yeah, I hit the trifecta on all three of those emotions. I don't know about Dana, but I certainly hit some different moments, each to themselves. So then, what I guess is your personal relationship with this movie?
I watched it maybe 10 years ago. It came out in 2010, I think, or 2009.
So Christmas Day 2009.
So I must have watched it when I was pretty young. And I remember, I think I was in high school and I was absolutely like, wow, like this is a movie that I thought it was just incredible how it could make me like feel so much. And since then, I've introduced this film to a lot of non-Indian friends of mine just because I like you. And there's a lot of Bollywood films, and I have a lot of favorites, but this is one that there's just so much that happens, and it has a lot of good messaging, and that's why I I recommend it as usually my first to people if they're gonna watch any Bollywood film.
And this being the most successful Bollywood film of all time, I'm sure that doesn't hurt at all either.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's actually the most financially successful film of all time. Dad, I remember talking to you about this over the weekend, and we both felt it was a surprisingly good movie. For me, it was surprising due to having no idea what this was going to be or what it was going to be about, but having a certain amount of fun, drama, cliffhanger, surprises, and heart. What made it good for you?
I enjoyed the indictment of the status quo, and I liked the interrelationship. I liked the basically, thumbing your nose at conventional wisdom and going your own route. I liked the humor, and I liked just the storyline itself and how each of the characters grew, with the a possible exception of one, and we'll get into that. He didn't need to grow; everybody grew around him.
That's an interesting thought.
Yeah, and I thought, because it was basically he came in, and the first time you're exposed to him in the film, he ends up committing something that's like completely undone or not done by taking on the seniors of the class and ending the hazing practice that had been obviously a ritual for a number of years.
Yeah, I know it's going to be reflected in some of my scoring later, but I thought that unlike a lot of other conventional college movies, this had a lot more to say. And like I said, we'll dive into that as we get further along in the analysis of this. But it really felt that they were making much more of a social commentary. It wasn't just frat humor the whole time. And that ultimately it was the growth and maturation of three people while going against the normal trends. So, with that, let's get even further into this. Dad, do you have your plot summary ready?
I do. Two friends are contacted by an old classmate regarding the whereabouts of a long lost friend. Ranchoddas, Rancho Shyamaldas or Chanchad, played by Aamir. They soon embark on a quest to locate Rancho, but on the way reminisce about the years when the three were in the Imperial College of Engineering, run by Director Viru, Virus, Sahastrabuddhe, played by Boman Irani, a dictatorial teacher who pressures students to follow a discipline of memorization and structured study. Farhan Qureshi, played by R. Madhavan. Raju Rastogi, played by Sharman Joshi. Remember their trials, triumphs, and antics with Rancho in school as they continue their search. Included in their memory is the history of Rancho and Virus and Ranchero's love for Khan Virus's daughter, Pia, played by Kareena Kapoor, as well as their student nemesis, Chatur Ramalingam, Omi Vaidya. Will the two friends find Rancho?
All right, cast for this movie: Aamir Khan as Ronchadas Rancho Shyamaldas Chanchad, also known as Chahot, or Funsuk Wangdu. R. Madhavan as Farhan Qureshi, Sharman Joshi as Raju Rastogi, Boman Irani as Dr. Viru Virus, Sahastrabuddhe. Kareena Kapoor Khan as Pia Sahastrabuddhe, Omi Vaidya as Chatur Ramalingam, Rahul Kumar as Manhoman, nicknamed Millimeter, Mona Singh as Mona Sahastrabuddhe, Parikshit Sani as Mr. Qureshi, Farida Dadi as Mrs. Qureshi, Amardeep Jha as Mrs. Rastogi, and Mukund Bhatt as Mr. Rastogi. All right, let's move to recognition then. The film's worldwide lifetime gross was 459.96 crore, the equivalent of $90 million in the US, making it the highest grossing Indian film at the time. The film was listed in Guinness World Records for the record for highest box office film gross for a Bollywood film. The film also won 58 accolades for Indian Film Awards. Among these are 6 Filmfare Awards, including Best Film and Best Director, 3 National Film Awards, including Best Popular Film, 10 Star Screen Awards, 17 IFA Awards, 5 GEMA Awards, 2 Aspara Awards, and 7 Bollywood Hungama Surfer's Choice Movie Awards. In China, it was nominated for the Best Foreign Film Prize at the first Beijing International Film Festival in 2011. In Japan, it was nominated in the Best Outstanding Foreign Language Film category at the 37th Japan Academy Awards in 2014. The award was eventually won by Les Miserables. In addition, Three Idiots won the grand prize at the 4th Vidyasan Awards, held by the Japanese Organization of Home Video Retailers in 2014. Three Idiots was selected as 2013's best video release, beating thousands of films, anime, and television shows, including domestic Japanese and foreign Hollywood productions. Did you know? Although Rancho is seen as a college student for most of the film, the actor who plays him, Aamir Khan, was 44 years old when the film was made. In real life, he is only 5 years younger than Boman Irani, the actor who played Virus, the headmaster at Rancho's school. Did you know? The film was shot in reverse. The present day scenes were shot first and then the college scenes. Did you know? In 2013, renowned Hollywood filmmaker Steven Spielberg praised Three Idiots, which he had seen 3 times, and said he loved the emotional undertones. He listed it as one of 5 films that he connected with, along with The Godfather and his own work on E.T., Saving Private Ryan, and Jaws. Did you know? The wall Chatur pees on was painted and christened Rancho Wall by Lee's Druk Padma Karpo School. It became a popular picture spot for tourists. So, with that, what is this movie about? And we will start with our guest.
I think this movie is about a lot of things, and hearing the two of you, I think, Dana, when you were talking about the like challenging unconventional thinking and societal norms, I think on one layer it is about that, but honestly, I feel like when you have a character as strong as Rancho, watching it like makes me feel like I just want to be a better person. Just how like some of the qualities he showed of how he was so confident in his own ways and like didn't worry. I feel like he was like rusticated from the College of Engineering like multiple times, or like he just was so set in this idea like all is well, that he was able to change so many people around him. And I think while the film is about a lot of things, his character is just like in my mind just really inspiring, especially like just how he was as a kid and like where they took him to, and then even how he at the end ended up as like giving back.
Dad, I have some thoughts on what I would think this is about, but if you were to suggest it to a friend, how would you describe it?
Buddy quest film centered around the dreams and demands of the characters and their families, challenging conventional wisdom as they go.
Yeah, I think the adventure part is certainly a big portion of why this movie works. With the exception of the flashbacks, which kind of work in a completely opposite way, there are really 2 courses of the film that are working in opposite poles. You have the adventure, the quest part of it, as you mentioned, that is the modern day, that keeps kind of the pace moving along, and interjected in parts gives you a lot of, I guess, downhill momentum toward what the inevitable conclusion is going to be, because you're filling in the past to understand where they are in the present. But likewise, you have to have enough information on the backstory to know why the quest is worthwhile. So it's kind of 2 stories told intermittently within each other. I had it down as really a social commentary masquerading as a buddy comedy. I'll just say that I think in the way that we've tried to predetermine people towards either certain professions, in this case, mostly engineers or doctors, that we've somehow tied in the expectations of what people are supposed to be based on who they are when they're born. And it's really trying to push back a lot on that, because really the epitomization of that is the Rancho character, who gets these opportunities to learn for the sake of learning, while not really being expected to be anything past his collegiate days, as we figure out midway through the movie.
Well, just a couple of comments. Having gone through a system of education much similar to the Imperial Engineering School, that being a law school, where they drive into you if you're not number one, you're nothing. And then coming out of it and realizing that what you should have learned early on in law school is just to laugh. Because the more the professors push you and tell you you have to be this genius in order to amount to anything as a lawyer, the more you should laugh at them, because there are a lot of people in the profession who, because of their people skills, don't finish top in their class, but they have an ability to connect with their clients, to connect with juries, to connect with judges, and to be very successful without being the smartest guy in the room or the smartest lady in the room. And the other aspect is when you come from something which I did, which nobody in my family had ever gone to college, and there was a sense of, almost this pressure placed on you to succeed and show the family that it could be done. And you finally have to come to terms with, hey, I'm doing this for me, not for them. And so I need to take the pressure off myself for that reason. So those are two aspects of the film that spoke to me, because it talked to me about what I experienced as a 20 something going through this process.
Let's move over to best performance and keep this kind of moving along. Saloni, this is your movie. Let's start with you. Who did you think was the best performer?
It's really cool to do this because I've seen this film so many times, but this time watching it, I was like thinking about things a little bit more critically, and I think it's gonna have to go to Raju. I feel he had to grow as a character, and he had a lot of moments that were intense, whether it was out of like love for his friend who just saved his dad or fear for his life. And I mean, honestly, I feel like what makes the film really good is the acting, and it was a lot of good acting, but I really appreciated his acting.
So I also had Sharman Joshi as my best secondary performer. I think he has the most cathartic part out of anybody in the movie. From where he starts, and he's the one that's always kind of pulling back on anything that Rancho suggests or that Farhan and Rancho tried to do, or he's kind of the reluctant friend in all of this. He slowly comes out, but it's after that last, I guess, third act, when he goes into a coma and all of the other things that happen to him, and he shows off in that job interview, that you really get the sense that he's grown so profoundly as a character because he's been the hesitant one. So I think tracking the catharsis, he represents a lot of people that are resistant to the idea of something new. That this is how it's always been done. This is the expectation. This is what I've wanted out of my life. And I'm also fearful to not get to that place. He eventually learns to be able to stand on his own 2 feet despite his two broken legs, to paraphrase a quote from the end of the movie. Dad, who was your best performer?
Aamir Khan. I just think he was the glue that bound the whole film together. I mean, everything seemed to have tentacles that came off him, whether it was the growth of the other characters within the film, the changing of the director, however you wanted to say it. Ultimately, everything revolved around him. And I thought his performance was great. There was no variation. He was the same likable, consistent person from the beginning, no matter what happened throughout the film. He stayed consistent with himself. And it was a position where usually you're trying to look for growth. This was one where I've said there was no growth because he was consistent from the beginning of the film pretty much to the end of the film. And the growth was off from everybody around him. And he effectuated the growth in them.
That isn't to say that I don't think he had his moments of doubt, fear, or struggle, particularly when you get to the newborn delivery near the end of the film. That's kind of a panic moment in a lot of ways, that he's really having to stand up in a situation that nobody else could probably handle except him. He was also my best performer as well, because there's the way this movie plays out, he's almost a messianic figure. He's the center of attention, but he's not only showing a new way, but he's also bringing them along on this path and almost can do no wrong. Every time they're in some hazy situation, he has this godlike ability to somehow make the situation better, or all is well. And I don't think there are many actors that can be this gregarious and charismatic, which I'm tipping my hand there as well, that could pull all of this together and make it worthwhile. If you get somebody that isn't nearly as energetic to try and pull this off, I don't think this movie works, and yet it works in spades.
I If you guys are gonna hopefully watch other Bollywood films, Amir Khan is a great actor and he's done a lot of different characters. So I'd be excited to see, because this role was very specific, and yes, he delivered it really well. So, but he's done totally different vibes. So it would be, but yeah, he's a great actor.
He's only 2 years younger than you, Dad.
Yeah.
There's a reason, though, that I expect that he is, I think, a top five highest paid actors in Bollywood of all time. So, but let's move it along. Dad, who is your best secondary performer?
Boman Irani. He just it would be so easy for that character in the middle of it to start realizing how horrible he is just by the sheer happenstance, and to start moderating his behavior. He maintained the villain evilness of his character until the birth scene. And it wasn't until that moment that he really kind of opened up and showed that he was something more than just the hard ass that he portrayed throughout 95% of the film. And I thought he was funny. He was able to be gregarious and still, I mean, you hated him, but you didn't hate him. You hated what he was, but the character, or the character itself, had certain, you almost kind of sympathized with how bad he was, that he didn't realize how horrible he was. I found that there was a certain sympathetic quality to that.
See, you and I have very different opinions on this one, and that's unusual for us because we often have mind melds on these. I thought he was very much a caricature, and it had to be for a comedy that didn't drown out too much where you have a very dark character, because realistically that could have been played very, very, very darkly, given the fact that he's at least on two occasions thought of as being a murderer. But I don't know if it's the birth scene that is the thing that really makes him vulnerable so much as Pia's confrontation toward him about her brother, his son, and the circumstances surrounding that, him hounding him with pressure. I would also push back that it's only a fleeting moment of vulnerability, because I don't know if he ever completely gave up on his anger toward Rancho. I don't know, maybe it is vitriol toward him. I think at best you get that small moment with the space pen, and that's about it. But that's as far as he was willing to go, because I think enduring some of the pain that you've clearly seen in others, hurt people, and he is clearly a hurt person.
That's all he could do. I mean, he couldn't be any more than that, because then he would be betraying everything that he had been through his entire life and his whole career. I mean, just the fact that you opened that little glimpse in was a miracle. And you were in on that small opening. And then it slammed back shut again. And that took something, because once you've reached that point, it's hard for an actor to be able to go back to being the obnoxious, villainous person that you were before, after you've opened up that little bit. It's just beyond what is normal for a human to be able to revert back to a unnatural position. Once you start being kind, it's hard to go back to being a hard ass.
I feel like that night was a lot because like the moment before he also just found out that his son had committed suicide, and I think it the way it was like the way that whole scene went down with like one daughter trying to stop the other daughter, it really made it seem like he really had no idea and really thought it was an accident. And so I think like so much he had to go through so much in one night, and then that led to the like, oh, you can be a soccer player if you wanted to the kid.
Yeah, I don't know if it's full catharsis. It's the one thing that's really missing from the end of that piece of the film because we don't really get a lot of time with him when we go to, I guess, Pia's wedding day. He's just kind of seen slightly there as they kind of run away, and so you don't get that final moment beyond that really says that he's turned a corner. But I don't know. I find this character to be more well written than well played at times, and I don't know if he is redeemable in my mind. I know that it makes for the ending, but I'm almost more happy for Rancho than I am for Virus to be able to get to that point because I don't know how he doesn't make the turn when Raju jumps out his window.
Uh,
I mean,
Yeah,
seriously, you've clearly led him to that point where he is willing to do that out of your window while you're sitting there trying to take a power nap and you have nothing to show for it, no change whatsoever. Not only that, but you're going to double down. You're so upset that he got the job after that that you're going to make his test even tougher. I realistically, this guy shouldn't be redeemable.
it I feel like it literally started from the day Rancho raised his hand and was like, "Why can't you take a pencil to space?" I feel like this man for 30 years had never been questioned, and because some guy had the audacity to question him, like it became his mission. And because and just by default of Rancho associating with those two guys, I think he just he just wanted to show at the end of it he was the boss. And I feel like when he at the end could say that lead gets in your eyes, that meant a lot to him, that he could finally be right about something. But yeah, I don't know.
I've said for a long time that I'm 57. The number of people I've known in my life that have had major visible changes where you can go, "He's a completely different person than they were to begin with," I can probably name on or count on one hand. I mean, what you basically have by the time you're about 25 or 30 is what you have. You at best can have the corners rounded off, and that's about it. Whereas I thought that,
That's a very cynical way of looking at things, Dad.
well, I understand.
Saloni, well, who is your best secondary performer?
Probably Amir Khan. Yeah, I think he really played the role well in every single scene. He was able to like there were scenes where he was appreciated, like I think when he brought Raju's dad to the hospital and like he did the right thing there. Like there was a lot of expressions I feel like he had to denote in his physical structure and face that aren't just like happy or sad. There were like very complex emotions because he did good things for other people, but he also had like an innocence about the way he would react to things. Like with I feel like scenes with Pia, or like some of the silly things he did to get things, like when the professor asked if he asked the professor if he knew any of their names, and then he like mixed up all the papers and they ran out of the room. I feel like he was just able to switch into these like silly modes when he needed to be, and really good at acting, like not like just your basic emotions.
I also think that he had to stretch at times for some of the other emotional moments. I think it's on multiple occasions, particularly in several of the hospital scenes, that he quite notably has to wipe away tears. But I think I don't know if you would say it's happy or it's reluctance, but there's kind of a hidden part of himself when Pia tries to come on to him towards the end of the movie and he has to turn her away knowing that he's got to walk away from all of that at some point. So that's a very complicated scene as an actor to try and do well because it's a flurry of emotions, not just one. Now, I also had him as my most charismatic. I think I've pretty well explained that already. that he's just an absolute supernova throughout most of this film. And he just pops up in the best ways. He is entertaining. He's just about everything that you could want out of a leading star in this movie. But let's go back to you, Saloni. Who did you have as your most charismatic?
Probably him.
I think he's an easy one to pretty well nominate. He ends up being the biggest part of any scene that he's in. Dad, is it a three-way tie, or did you go off the beaten path?
Off the beaten path.
Oh, good.
I'm going to keep a consistent pattern here over the last several weeks. It's Kareena Kapoor. I just thought she was absolutely wonderful, and I fell in love with her by the end of the film. And if he didn't marry her, I was willing to. And it took a lot because not only did you have to deal with her, you knew what you got for a father-in-law.
All right, so let's get into best scenes then. Saloni, let's give you the first crack. What was, I guess, the first scene you'd like to nominate?
There are so many good scenes in this film. It's hard. I hope that out of the three of us, we get really good three scenes because it's hard for me to pick one. So I'm just going to say one of my favorites, I think, is where Raju's dad comes with Rancho and Pia on the motorcycle to the hospital. And Raju is really angry and is like, "You brought my dad on a motorbike." And he doesn't even say anything. And it's when the doctor says, like, if he hadn't come on a motorcycle, he would have died. And I think just the expression in change in Raju's face of like the gratitude, but also how afraid he was that his dad was going to die and how he just goes and embraces him. I just thought that was such a powerful moment of like, thank you, Rancho, for like being you. And I really felt that moment.
Yeah, and there's also a bit of embarrassment and humility in that as well, that you were just rebuking him, but it was out of a place of fear, and I think he understands that. So then there's a completely different emotional change in that. Dad, what did you have down as your first nominee?
The hazing and the spoon.
Yep, so that was the first one I had down too.
I just thought that was great. And being from the American Midwest and from the son of a dairy farmer or grandson of a dairy farmer, there's an old adage is never pee on the electric fence. And there's all kinds of stories about city kids coming to visit and the kids all saying, "Hey, if you want to really try something, do this." And ending up in a similar circumstance. I liked it simply because he was able to get one up over the seniors. He also came up with the solution within a span of the guy counting to 10. And not only coming up with the solution, being able to create the device and implement it within that short span.
Yeah, it certainly was memorable for me where I thought some of the first part of this movie was pretty clunky because they really don't explain very well what's happening until they get on top of the building. And him faking the heart attack to get off of a plane, I'm like, this is a really weird way to start a film. But by the time you get to that scene, you're like, okay, now we've kind of gotten into the heart of the movie. They know what they're trying to do and where this thing is going to start going. And it picks up the pace quite well about that point. Because I thought that could have been a prank from just about any college movie. But to be able to use it here, where it reminded me a lot of several of the stories our good friend Chris Jardine tells, but this sounds very much like an engineer's prank. So I thought it was a very well written scene. So my first nominee then is the space pen, and I think we've alluded to it a couple of different times, but it's the introduction of it at the beginning because it's really a good exposition scene for Virus on setting up exactly the standards of his character and his values in the same sentence. Everything is about competition, about shoving everybody else out of the way. You are pursuing excellence for the sake of excellence's sake, because if you don't compete, you die. Whereas it seems like Rancho's entire philosophy and value system is based on community and a rising tide lifts all boats. And him simply answer or asking a very simple question that pokes, no pun intended, a hole in his story really serves to undermine exactly the difference between those two opposing forces that's going to be the continuation through the rest of the film. So, Dad, what was your next one then?
Crashing the wedding. Just the fact that Rancho was going to prove to Paya that her boyfriend or her fiance was a jerk, and would be able to do it by just doing it. That's kind of the kind of thing that, quite frankly, I would have prided myself on being able to do.
I love the fact that almost every way that he gets out of trouble with anything in the movie, it's with something extremely clever that wouldn't have occurred to me. And yet, when the solution is presented, like you've already mentioned, the shuffling of papers with the test, or the mint sauce on the shoes, or the scooter situation, or any of these other things, it just seems so clever and fits exactly what you want it to be without somehow being over the top at the same time. These all fit naturally within the course of the character, and I just appreciated the amount of good writing that it had, because it really does set up that guy to, to tell you exactly how much those shoes are, and how many times is that a cliche in movies.
Okay, wait. I have two more scenes that I want to nominate. One where Rancho's convincing Raju that Farhan is going to marry his sister. how, how much of like a just like how it like goes into the effect of like what he's seeing, and Farhan is like visibly like but then and then right after that, when so in India we like he comes in with a box of sweets that's like candy, like when he's coming in and like feeding everyone sweets in the hospital because he's like finally woken up, and just like the music in that scene when he's running in and like it's like really happy, and you can see on Raji's face like I'm just so grateful to be alive and that like my friends are here and they're celebrating. I really like that scene as well.
Yeah, it was kind of a confusing watch for me there for a minute, because they had all been trying to be happy, not be sad, trying to bring him out of a coma. And the thing that ended up bringing him out, I thought was more anger than like relief, which I thought was an interesting tactic, but fair enough. So then the next one that I had down was Chatur's speech and challenge, because I think that's the climax of the Lord. I think about the first hour of the movie, especially with how this movie starts. And I did say it was a bit clunky, but when he reveals the September 5 thing, you think that's going to be somehow like this emotional climax to the movie, and that everything's going to be leading up to that point. To get that only about an hour of the way into the film, and pretty much kind of the climax of the first act, more or less, I thought was a really interesting choice and rather daring, because we're trying to fill in the blanks. Now we don't have the thing that normally in most movies that are written in flashback like that we're trying to fill in the blanks for. We've kind of already given that away. So okay, what are we going to do for the next hour 45 minutes? Well, it's just as satisfying, but now we just have other things that we're going to fill in. So I respected them for the choices that were made in that. And it's also just a really fun scene, because replacing certain words, I'm just trying to think of how many other things that you could replace so well and it makes sense. So, Dad, what would be your next one be?
I had the suicide attempt. To be honest, I actually did not envision that happening. I mean, he's got to make a choice between family or friend, and I never thought to me that the verdict would be neither. So it shocked me to begin with. And then the fact that he was able to jump out a third story window and land without any major physical and mental ramifications was interesting. And and then the whole part where they're, we've already discussed scenes in the hospital of bringing him back. But I just thought that was a very it was a scene that I did not anticipate.
No, I followed you very much on that path, because I thought for sure something was going to interrupt and let him off the hook, or something was going to do that. And for that to happen, not only was it a surprise, but it really upped the emotional stakes of the movie. To drive that in the middle of a comedy is almost unheard of. So let's see here. My next one up, The Real Rancho. I could have seen this one playing out in a lot of different ways, but it really wasn't until you got that mid movie reveal that this wasn't the real Rancho and that he was living in somebody else's shoes, that I think that this movie added a little bit more to its resume. I think, again, that's a bold choice in writing that this is, again, a played out cast movie. The rich guy being imitated by the less than, who is clearly talented and is potentially going places, but now can't live up to that because the expectation is that he's going to live out his schooling service in order to bring pride to this rich guy's family. And I thought this was an unusual but fitting choice as to the explanation behind everything else. Again, this is coming about the midpoint. So now we've had two fairly significant reveals, the third being the final scene, but we'll get to that here in a second. So, Dad, any other nominees?
The actual partaking in the school itself at the end of the film, the reveal of the houseboy being there and how he knew everybody, and then the kids pulling the same spoon prank in the building. That whole thing, I loved that. I it was clear. I mean, I had figured out who Rancho really was about 3/4 of the way through the film. It was the birth scene that ultimately convinced me. I'm like, oh, he's just creating devices on the fly. This guy's the guy with all the patents.
Yeah, I didn't get that at all. It was a complete surprise to me, and I think the payoff worked really well because I hadn't thought of that at all. It came completely out of left field, and so I think it worked a little bit better on me at the end.
But I just love that school scene because it was all a bunch of kids who were going to be little ranchos.
The power of ingenuity and just basic curiosity. I think that's one of the underappreciated values.
Okay, I'm gonna just to add, there's so many scenes. Just to add my one more, I think when Roger's in the interview and they're just asking like, "Why did you jump out a window?" and he's like, "Oh, because I peed on the director's mailbox." And they're like, "Why did you do that?" He's like, "Oh, I got drunk with my buddies." Like, just like the frankness of that scene of how he was so just like matter of fact of who he was, and then he like was like, okay, bye, and then they're like, welcome, and he just turned around and he was so grateful. I thought that was also really, that was just the scene that showed his growth, other than the fact that he also wasn't going to cheat later on.
Well, I don't know about you, Dad, but I thought the way that that played out, you would expect them. I've seen so many scenes where the frankness overwhelms the interviewer at that point, and they're just handing him the job, and that would have been fine. It would have played out. But I think the reason that this particular scene sticks out as well as it does is that they tell him, "Well, you're just going to have to get rid of your attitude." Well, no, I'm not willing to do that. So it's not only the cliche of putting him in that situation, but also saying you've got the emotional payoff of it's taken me everything to get to this point. I'd rather have that because there are going to be other opportunities. I've truly grown to the point where I'm a new person. And okay, well, that's exactly what we wanted to hear because most people aren't willing to do that. The other one that I wanted to highlight, and it's kind of in the same vein as the suicide attempt, but that one's more tense. The new birth scene is just frantic because I think you're off such an emotional high of the son committing suicide, that whole reveal, the vulnerability that's in Pia and Virus and her sister. And then you have to go into this. And it very much reminded me of the same scene from Parasite. Whereas the flood, there's also a very tumultuous situation going on in that particular situation. You have tons of water. You have to do this complete makeshift scenario. He's got to invent all of these things on the fly and deliver a baby while doing this on a remote webcam. I mean, it feels so much like last year in a lot of ways that you had to just kind of reinvent your life that I thought it was realistically, and especially with how that scene ends with the him giving out the space pen to be the emotional, I guess, climax of the movie for me. So, does anyone have any other scenes to nominate or anything we missed? I think we hit most of the big ones.
One more. I think I'm just going to nominate one more, and it's the scene where Farhan is telling his dad he wants to be a photographer. And I really love the line where his dad was like, "Did you just watch a movie and you're just like filming in your head?" And then I think it really brings it home when he, and also when he's like, "What if I say you can't become a photographer? You're just going to kill yourself." And I feel like that also ties into like what happened with Raju and Joy earlier in the movie. But I think like when he takes out the photo of his parents and is like, Rancho made me put this in my wallet, and then he like closes the laptop and says he wants to buy a camera. I just think the progression of that scene was powerful, especially because his dad didn't agree right away and was and like the comments he made about like killing himself and stuff were really that's like that was well I feel like written.
For every kid who has not felt like they've been seen by their parents, I think that would resonate well. So we've gotten a lot of your favorite Saloni. Then, what is your overall favorite scene, if you had to pick one?
That's too hard. I can't. Is that allowed?
I suppose we've never had anybody actually do it, but sure.
Okay, great.
You're first.
There's always a trailblazer on the path to greatness. Dad, what was your favorite then?
Well, I always enjoy the humor in a film if I can find it. And the speech didn't take much, just changing one word that he repeatedly says, and then one other phrase, and it makes it into just an absolute snafu. And that just loved that.
Yeah, I kind of had to nominate two, so I guess I'm making up for your lack of a nomination in this. But really, for me, it was, as I referred to it, the urination shock and then the space pen. Both of those, I think, were where this movie really starts to take off and build some momentum. And I really liked the way that that took off because I became fully immersed after about that point. So then, most indelible for me, realistically, if I'm going to think back on anything in this movie, it's probably that whole delivery scene. Everything that's going on, the panic, but also because of the emotional climax and the catharsis that goes on in that. I think there are a couple of things that stick out just fresh in my mind. But if I was really to say, if I thought about this in another 2 to 3 years, what's going to stick out? It's probably that scene. Dad, what did you have down?
I had the same scene because that just stuck in my mind. I What I usually do is after I watch the film or I finish the film is before I fall off to sleep, I'll just lay there and I'll kind of recap my day. I'll go back to the film, and whatever scene from the film pops into my head first is the most indelible moment to me, and that's the one that I remembered right off the bat.
Saloni, what is the most indelible moment of this movie for you?
Indelible meaning like remembering moment.
Seared in your brain.
Maybe them just like running in the hospital when they're trying to like I think when Raju's admitted in the hospital and they're like well okay so the reason the reason I'm saying that though is gonna tie into like my favorite song of the movie, which is like "We're Not Gonna Let You Go," and I just feel like when they're just I don't know if I'm confusing that with that scene, but I mean you've already heard a bunch of my favorite scenes, so there's a song that's like "Jane Nahi Denge Tujhe," and that's like blasting like, and that means we're not gonna let you go, and like when they're like going after like Raju's in the coma, like that's the song that's playing the whole time. Like when they're trying to like make him happy, they're trying to like that's the song, and it's just so like I just really like that song.
Yeah, I find that a lot of memories are often tied to certain emotional states that they're the strongest around strong emotions of mine, or memories that I have that are the most vivid tend to be related in some capacity to how I was feeling at the time. But that seems like a good place to take a quick break. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back. Thank you for rejoining us. Okay, quickly, Dad, do we have anyone to remember this week?
Yes, Joanne Linville. She was an actress. She was 93. She had done A Star Is Born, Scorpio, and James Dean. Passed away of natural causes this week.
Do you know which version of A Star Is Born was she in?
I believe it's the 1950s version with James Mason.
Oh, also in The Goddess, Seduction, or The Seduction, Twilight Zone, Star Trek. Yes, the 1970s version, actually, of A Star Is Born,
Oh,
not the Judy Garland version.
the one with
Barbara Streisand and Chris Christopherson.
okay, my mistake.
No, it's all right. If you want to look her up or any of her movies, again, we mention these to remember her fondly through her work, and please go find any of that to watch this week. All right, so let's get over to best lines, funniest lines. It can be either. We've kind of just combined the two at times. And this is, again, going to be very similar, I think, to our Seven Samurai episode where we're doing this best lines or best quotes all in the translated English version. So forgive us a little bit for that. I feel a little weird nominating best lines when I'm not doing it in the original language, but we'll make our best attempt. Dad, what is your first one up?
Pursue excellence, and success will come chasing you.
Saloni, what did you have up?
All as well.
Yeah, I think that's the capper. I was going to save that one for the end, but yeah, that one I absolutely had to be in there. My first one up, Rancho. Learning is not memorizing the exact words from the book. Learning is understanding it and being able to explain it in your own words. Dad?
Rancho. These engineers are very smart, sir. They didn't invent a machine which can measure the pressure on the brain. If they had, we would have come to know that this is not a suicide, but a murder.
Saloni, did you have another one?
Yes. Life is a race. If you don't run fast, you'll be like a broken unda. Broken unda as in broken egg.
Rancho, and this is a college, not a pressure cooker. The lion in a circus learns that he needs to sit on the chair if his owner has a whip in his hand, but that lion is called well trained, not well educated.
Grades create divide. A. Masters. C. Slaves.
Rancho, sir, what number one, sir? Here we don't talk about new ideas or about new inventions. We only talk about getting good grades or a good job in the USA. We don't gain any knowledge here, sir. They only teach us how to bring back good grades here. Did either of you have any other nominees?
No, I don't.
All right, then let's turn our attention to the Stanley rubric. And because our guest is not as inundated with all of the nuances of the rubric, Dad, I'm going to give you first up because legacy can be a little bit tricky if you're not used to the show.
All right. So legacy, I went with looking up first of all what the general legacy was within. I changed this a little bit simply because it's a international film to us and to our grading. So what I did instead of looking at the critic score, I looked at the home country or home region and gave that a 5. I mean, it was the highest grossing film in Bollywood of all time. It had a huge following. It opened in something like 1,600 theaters across India, China, and Indochina, so like Cambodia and Thailand. It was huge. So I gave that a 5. The fact I gave it a 4 is simply because apparently, and I did not know much about this, it had a pretty good following when it was released almost simultaneously on YouTube and was watched pretty well by certain elements of society in the United States and Canada and in Europe on YouTube. So to that extent, I gave it a 4 simply because there's enough presence of people in the United States and across Europe and North America in general that are becoming more appreciative of both this film and Bollywood in general. I think to some extent, Slumdog Millionaire opened the eyes of a lot of Americans that there actually is films being done someplace other than Hollywood, and I think that that is growing. So that's why I gave it a 9.
So there are a couple of things that I need to mention here just off the top. Number one, I don't know what you saw, and I'm not going to refute it just completely, but from my research, I actually saw that there was a promise made by the producers to upload this to YouTube within 12 days after its release. However, apparently that never happened. So that's where maybe there's a difference because I
It
don't know
did,
if
but it was
this.
about a year gap.
Okay. Well, then maybe. I don't know. That's what I had seen in mind.
It was also then taken down relatively shortly afterwards because they found out that the streaming services were interested.
A couple of the other notes that I'd like to say just about the international market. I don't know if it's just something like Slumdog Millionaire, because that was made by Danny Boyle, who is a Scotsman. So, like, as much as the international movie scene is there, I don't know if we can count our British counterparts sometimes as being so far removed as some of the other filmmakers that we've had, even in the last decade. We've had Alfonso Cuarón, we've had Ang Lee, we've had Inarritu win 2 Oscars for Best Director. We had Bong Joon Ho 2 years ago for Parasite. I mean, there's plenty of non-white people making films and making good international features that are getting a lot more notoriety. So I don't think it's that alone, but I think the market is fresh for opening ourselves up to a lot of new cultural experiences in at least a few parts of America. I can't say that across the board. I agree. I think that this is an absolutely beloved film in a section of the world. I don't know if it's completely translated here, but it is in certain sections. And I think that this is somewhat of a cult movie in the States. It's not treated as such in areas where there are just tons more people. Uh, the fact that this is one of, I think it's been in my research repeatedly said, like the 12th favorite movie in China. I don't know how you can measure favorites exactly, but like it was the number 1 movie in Korea like 3 years after it came out or something like that when it first released there. Every time a new audience somehow gets introduced to this, that they appreciate and love the movie. And I think that has staying power just on its own, that slowly over time, we're going to ingratiate ourselves much in the same way that we have with certain other international films such as Fellini or Kurosawa, as we're eventually going to bring up on the podcast. We've already done 1 episode on Kurosawa, that this movie is going to have legs the further out we get. But as it sits right now, because that if I mentioned this to anybody on the street, and when you mentioned this to me 2 months ago, I had no idea what this movie was. I'm glad I know it now, and I'm hoping that we're promoting the openness of this type of movie, but I have to kind of roll it back because unfortunately one of the biggest exports of America is our culture on the rest of the world, either through English or our music or whatever else, and that's changing where like Bad Bunny, right, might be the best or biggest hip hop artist in the world, and he doesn't sing in English. But it's slowly transforming as we go along with my generation or the generation behind me yet as to what they're going to prefer cultural tastes and towards that. So I can't give it full points on that part of it. I think the audience category is probably about a 4 in my mind. I give the industry an additional 4 because again, I think this is not star making roles, but since these guys like Amir Khan had been in the industry for a while, this isn't like a newer movie, but this might be his biggest movie to date. So again, with the amount of awards that it won, with the amount of critical success that it won, I think just about anybody who has reviewed the film has at least something positive to say. So I gave this an 8 overall, 4 from each category after I divided it. But all right, so after all of our consternation and nuance on that, do you feel like you have a handle for that, Saloni, and could give us a score?
I think I would go with a 9 or a 10. And I
So
think,
let's give you a 9.5.
okay, sure. Also, wait, I wanted to, I don't know if it's too late, but there's a scene that I do have ingrained in my head that we didn't even bring up in favorite scenes.
Please do.
Okay, so culturally, I'm curious how you guys took this scene, but when Pia and Rancho were in her room and she was like, and he had dokla, which is a common Indian dish, and she was like, you Gujaratis have such like khatarnak, like dangerous sounding names. And she's just listing out food names like dokla, fafda, and then she's like, Bush dropped 2 doklas on Iraq. And it's like, that was just a really funny scene because the part of India he's from, she's making a cultural commentary on how his food is so dangerous sounding, and that scene is just like really funny.
I completely missed it in translation. I'm like, yeah, this is probably funny to anybody that can understand it, but completely over my head. So, The average then between all of us after your 9.5 is 8.83 for Legacy. Dad, want to give us first up on impact significance?
Again, I looked at the impact and the significance. Obviously, this had a major impact to some extent because, as you commented, when Steven Spielberg was commenting about this being an emotionally charged film for him, and there's so many people that like this, and it's gaining in popularity, but it's not a film that I was aware of, and not that I'm well versed in all aspects of cinema, but I mean, I'm not the typical show up for the shootout car chase film. So to that extent, I had to give it some reduction. I went with a 7.5 for that reason. Obviously, it has a lot, and I'm open to the fact that I'm a middle-aged white guy living in the central United States, where winters are below or 25 to 30 degrees below Celsius, and I have no idea what goes on sometimes culturally in the rest of the world.
You and I actually thought about it somewhat inversely. I actually had a higher impact score in the immediate because I think this was a bigger movie at the time or around the time that it came out. Again, within that 5 year window, you had a lot of international markets that ended up releasing this film to great acclaim. It won a ton of awards in multiple countries. It just wasn't in the United States. So I think from an audience, given the amount of box office and commercial critical success that it had, I ended up at a 5 for the audience, 4.5 for the industry, just because of the appreciation that was there. And I think this gives a lot more opportunity to other things that were going on. But I know that several places that in my research I found also said that it had somewhat of an emotional impact on the education system that's currently going on through India. So to me, that says it has almost an immediate impact that you could throw on and tack on top of it. So 9.5 to me doesn't seem too estranged.
I'm going to change mine based on your comments, and I'm going to go with 8.5 based just on your points. You convinced me. I was waffling on my number.
So Saloni, what did you have?
Okay, so I apologize, but I think I misunderstood. The first time we gave the score, I thought we were doing overall with all of these categories. Now I understand we're going category by category. So, keeping that in mind, yeah, I think I would just give it a 10. It came out in 2009 and I feel like it's going to be relevant for a really long time and impact a lot of people.
Well, that makes the math easy on me anyway, because I had an 8, Dad had a 9, and you had a 10, so it's going to end up as a 9 average. I like easy math. So then on impact significance, what do you have down?
Okay, so then I would say I wish I apologize. I think just out of not knowing, I wish I did more research on maybe like what happened in terms of society. I want to give it a 10 again simply because I think a lot of families went to see this movie together probably in theaters, and having it so high rated in like a bunch of Asian countries, it is really pushed to go into like engineering or medicine. And I think the people who are either in college at the time or deciding their life, they might have watched this film and really actually made changes in the present day. So I just think that the messaging is strong enough that it was impactful for the people who watched it at the time.
No, certainly I can see that, and frankly, you may have more of a firsthand experience with something like this than either of us would, and that sometimes makes up for our just simple lack of experience. All right, but that ends up being so it was a 9.5 for me, an 8.5 for Dad, and 10 for you for a 9.33 average between us. Let's go to novelty. Since you've had trouble with the categories, I won't make you go first on any of these, but I guess I'll give my novelty on this. This one was tough for me because I think I'm too removed from anything to do with Bollywood to really give it the type of critical eye that might be necessary. So I'm going to take a stab at what my perspective is, but again, I may not have enough context to know exactly how novel or not this is. I just seriously don't know. But this feels incredibly different from most American college films. I think most of those end up turning into bad dick and fart jokes and frat pranks, which, while sometimes funny with the physical humor, don't age well. I know that we have some controversial opinions on something like Animal House that eventually we'll get to. But I think this was different. While the humor was there and they did have some silliness to it, I don't think it's so out of place that it brought me away from the movie. And because, again, it had the heart to really have something to say on all of the systemic structures of what was going, not what was going on, but what is going on, or what is still in place, I thought was translatable. I think there's a reason why it is popular in a lot of East Asian countries or South Asian countries, because you see a lot of students, and I've seen this portrayed in a lot of different cases, that go into an educational system that is so rigorous, putting you essentially through a pressure cooker. I know that the suicide rate in China is extremely high for young people. I was not necessarily as familiar with the Indian culture, but I can see why it ends up being that way. And but really borrowing from the fact that they're incredibly studious and successful in the definitions of their professions or in achieving academic success, but at what cost sometimes if we don't necessarily think about it. So I think this is something that was incredibly novel to say, all right, we're going to use humor, we're going to give you some laughs, but we're going to talk about some serious topics. Suicide, what you're learning in education, especially because they're trying to almost undermine their way of thinking with a fairly liberal arts version of an American education, or in many ways, the class system. And I think all three of those being covered in a fairly entertaining film is novel in itself. I don't know if I'd put it ahead of some of the other notables. Again, when I'm lacking for context, I went and looked up at the list of the scores of other films that we've had and kind of started to compare and contrast. I ended up at a 7 because I think it's kind of on the same level as something like a Rocky or a My Fair Lady that we have at those scored levels. So that's kind of where I ended up, just for lack of knowledge, but a 7 seemed about right to me. Dad, what did you have down?
One of the things I did was start thinking about this, and again I commented about this being a critique in a large aspect of the educational system and the cultural system. And I'm not as familiar with India, but I can gather from this film some of the same aspects. I had the pleasure to travel to China in 2010. And one of the things that just struck me is that, in large part, because the culture is that there is no social safety net. When you're old and you can't work, there's nothing for you. The government doesn't provide you with a social security. Your family has to. And because there's the one child policy in China, your children have to be able to pay for you. And if they're married, to pay for their or for your in-laws too. And so there is a huge pressure in China where they go to school all day, and then the parents send them to tutoring and advanced classes in English and in mathematics and such after school and on Saturdays and Sundays. And so they create almost robotic children who are supposed to get these jobs to help support their parents when they're old. And and how long can that type of lifestyle be sustained, especially when you have influences of some other decadent cultures such as the United States, where although we don't have nearly as much free time as they do in Europe, you look at some of the Europeans where they have 6 weeks of vacation that are mandatory, and this kind of flies in the face. So it's a real struggle. So to that extent, I gave it high marks for novelty, but the general constraint of how it was should get marks down for me because it is a typical buddy film and a quest and all this. But I think that the film itself was put in that vehicle just so some of the more difficult concepts and the critiques and lampooning of what was going on would be palatable to a broader audience. If you just came out, did a serious film where you're criticizing the educational system and it's resulting in people committing suicide, how many people are going to line up to see it? Whereas if the film is funny and entertaining and is put in the right perspective, it has a broader appeal and actually has more impact. I went with a 7.5 on novelty for that reason. I mean, I understand that they had to put it within that context in order to get it out and into the public, so I had to give it marks down. But I almost feel guilty about giving it only a 7.5 for novelty because they had to do that in order to talk about some rather difficult and controversial subjects.
Yeah, and in thinking about it even stronger, and again, I looked up again on our categories here, but I'm going to raise mine a half point to match your 7.5. But Saloni, that leaves it to you. Do you think you have a good handle on this one and can give us a novelty score?
I will try. So the first question says, did this movie push boundaries of comedy, art, historical perspective cinema, or something else? And I think, Dana, when you were talking right now about how it talks about difficult issues, but it's also comedic, I definitely think it did push boundaries in that, like, the reason why this is one of my favorite films is because I think people will laugh and cry and like feel a lot of different emotions and just even I think Thomas, you were talking earlier about how they were able to flash back and like it's such a complicated story with so many scenes that still somehow tie together at the end, and they chronologically put this together in a way that still made sense and like still had like hard hitting moments that were really powerful, but then like silly moments that were just like jokes. And for that reason of like it wasn't just one powerful moment. Like there were so many and there were so many different emotions. I do want to rank it a little higher. So I think I'll leave it at a 9.
So your 9 gives us a average of 8, just a straight 8. Classicness. This is always probably the most difficult and nuanced category. So we'll give it to the nuance king himself. Dana, what do you have down?
All right, as I say every week, I start with a 5 and I give it points up or points down. I didn't see anything that was really cringeworthy necessarily. I guess you're not going to have the broadest sense of the public. For example, my mother in law and Tom's grandmother is not going to find the whole pee on the electrified spoon to be necessarily funny. So, so there's going to be a certain element of culture where they're just going to be appalled that they would do something like this in a film. And so I had to give a few points off on that. But uh, I guess to some extent, even though Pia is a doctor or is going to be a doctor, there's a certain aspect of her having to be saved from a life of a lousy marriage by a man ultimately that I thought was a little bit sexist, and so I gave it a few points down from that. Or and so I went with an 8.5 for those various reasons.
See, I don't take this is the one area where I'll push back is your ending point there because how we've popularly portrayed Indian marriage in at least American culture from everything that you've seen from the arrangements or how all of that takes place. I think it's almost a requirement as part of that, and so I really don't see that in the same way that you've made that comment before on other films where this seems fitting in with the hierarchy of things. Not to mention that she chooses to go after him. He is not necessarily saving her, other than from marrying the jerk and pointing out that he's a jerk. She still goes back to him, and I'm not gonna. That is one of my remaining questions, so I'll save that here for the end. But she runs after him with the help of the friends, but still, like she had choice and agency in all of that. I don't see that she couldn't have still married the jackhat with the
That's what
over
I'm
expensive
referring to.
shoes.
Is she had to be saved from marrying him? And how common are arranged marriages yet in India?
They are. I mean, I have cousins who've had arranged marriages within the past few years, but like I think the way arranged marriages are portrayed in Western media sometimes aren't like there's such a difference. Like it's like some similarly to how you could be like, oh, I have a friend, I'm gonna like who has a son, like maybe you should meet him. Like it's not like I think like arranged marriage has a broad spectrum of what that means and how it plays out because it's not like you have no choice or like and there's a lot more that goes into it in terms of like figuring out compatibility or like even like a time period where people get to know each other. Like I think the stereotypically it sounds a lot worse than sometimes it is, but I think there are still arranged marriages that are pretty bad that do happen. But I think it's like a wide spectrum of like I and just for like further context, like my parents had an arranged marriage, but my mom has three other sisters. One of the sisters just married like a guy she met in the building. Like in India, we call it arranged marriage versus love marriage. So you would say like, oh, my aunt had a love marriage, my parents had an arranged marriage. But like I'm saying that to say that like my grandfather didn't force all of his kids to like have an arranged marriage. There was choice along the way. But culturally today it all exists.
So what was your final number then, Dad?
8.5.
Okay. I similarly, I was fully trying to find ways not to give it a 10 because I really, I struggled for a bit. I ultimately came down on a couple of similar points to you, that there's some juvenility in this movie that isn't widely appreciated by everybody. I think for the most part it is, but I only gave that kind of like a half point. But the other part that I did, and this is unfortunate as an American, but it's something we kind of already touched on, is there's just the language barrier for some of the comedy. It's not as translatable. When you were talking about the food names, I completely over my head, and that's not for lack of trying. It's just simply there are not relatable things, and I wonder how American comedy sometimes is portrayed elsewhere. But so I ended up at a 9. So do you think you got a grasp of classicness for us?
I think so. I think maybe I think I'll go with a 9. And the reason I'm going with a 9 is I mean I think it's a classic. I literally watching this movie this time around for this podcast, I cannot remember how many times I've seen this film, and I think the only reason I'm going to give it a 9 is because yeah, the like I think the themes about like family and the questions about schooling, that's always going to change, but it might just come down to like maybe humor translating in several years from
Yeah, certainly. So then I gotta lead with you. We always give the guest the first option on rewatchability. See, being it this is one of your favorites, I have to assume it ranks pretty high on that list.
both of you. What's the most amount of times you've seen a film? If you were to,
There are quite a few movies that I've probably seen 30, 40 times. It really depends. I try to not rewatch a lot of stuff at this point. Like I made a concerted effort to really not like watch a ton of favorites or go back and stuff because there's just so much new that's currently going that it's hard to keep up with that. But
okay. So the reason I ask is because I'm struggling with this one because I have like this came out in 2009. I showed this to like my friends at a summer camp in 2014. I show this to people in college. Like I feel like I've rewatched this so many times with different audiences who weren't necessarily Indian just so that they could see it. But then this time watching it over, it felt I was watching it maybe a little bit more critically because of this process, which is also like really interesting. So I'm struggling a little bit because rewatchability is definitely high. I've seen it thousands of like not thousands, but now seeing it again, I'm like, okay, can I hear you
it's
guys
all right.
first?
So I'll try and sort through where I'm from, and this is the most subjective category. Dana often refers to it as the soul food category or the comfort food category. Like, what's your favorite thing to eat when you just really don't want to think about what you want to eat? The thing that you just grab for. It's kind of like it's kind of like Doritos in many ways. It's an easy snack food that you could just always put on and always enjoy. And the lightheartedness, the comedy, the way that this is translatable is easily accessible. The problem I'm going to have as the subjective is, as I described it right before we came on the air, the subtitles, you have to pay attention. I think there are too many movies, and I've tried really hard lately to put my phone to the side and not pick it up. But when we do these subtitled movies, and I enjoy them, probably because I end up focusing more on them when I'm having to watch them, but it takes a level of concentration. And because of the way I watched it on Netflix, that Netflix did the movie, it subtitled the Hindi, but it wouldn't subtitle the English. So even though it would intersperse very, very simplistic English, you still had to concentrate on listening and being attentive to things to make sure you were watching. And this is a 2 hour and 45-minute film, which you're not going to have all the time in the world sometimes to sit through that length of a movie. I think we often over reward sometimes maybe shorter movies, and I didn't think this was a slog, although there were a couple of spots where it probably could have used some better editing. I could have easily gotten this down to about 2:30 and it wouldn't have made a ton of difference, but ultimately the length is not as big a quibble for me, because if the movie's enjoyable, you don't seem to notice it as much. I ended up at a 6, but that's purely my subjective rating based on where I have some of these other movies in my comfort level. Like, and I've said before, I know when we get to it what the tens are going to be for me. They're like my favorite ones that I will turn to when I really don't have anything else to watch and be able to just watch through with no problem. I know what the 9.5s, the 9s are, and I compare everything against all of those. So I'm sure in your head you have the movies that you can easily return to, and it doesn't matter where you pick up on them or when you turn them on, they're going to be enjoyable. This is probably pretty high on that list for you. It just doesn't happen to be because of the other factors and context for me. Dad, do you want to add further nuance?
Couple of things. One is I tend to love rewatching comedy more than I love to rewatch drama, simply because to me, I mean, I have a very serious profession, very stressful. I like to, when I'm relaxing and I can't find anything that I really want, if I'm just sitting to veg out, I'm gonna watch. There's certain movies. If you add in there think about it, I would say that there's certain movies: Caddyshack, Groundhog Day, Airplane, Naked Gun, are in that comfort zone where if I'm really, really having a bad day, a nice glass of bourbon and one of those films will at least get me through until it's time for bed. Whereas there's another aspect of rewatchability. There are films that I just love, and I love exposing other people to them for the first time. And so I will sit and rewatch a film. I'll watch it within consecutive weeks if I find somebody who would appreciate it. And one of the films, when I was in a freshman in college, one of the films that I got involved in for the first time was a film called The 39 Steps, which was, I think, Alfred Hitchcock's last British film. And The 39 Steps was just, I thought this was the most awesome thing I'd ever seen. I had barely heard of Alfred Hitchcock. I became such a huge Hitchcock fan after that. And so we used to do this whole ritual with the exchange students, which we had 18 of from all over the world. I would always sit and would every year would watch Rear Window with them, because it's and North by Northwest, which are two of my favorite Hitchcock films, so that they would experience it. And I got more joy out of watching their reaction than watching the film. And so to that extent, there's a certain aspect. I know that I'm going to try to get my wife and daughter to watch this film.
Both of them. Allison's more likely to like this than Sarah.
Well, yes, simply because she has two very close friends who are Indian.
Well, and her time in Thailand.
But I think I would love to do it. So to that extent, I gave this a higher number than I would for the near comfort and rewatchability. There are certain films that you don't want to watch too often because they almost become too painful or too you lose the impact of them. I went with a 7.5 simply because there's a whole group of people that I would love to get to watch this film because I think they would have the same reaction I did as to the fact that this is really a good film. If not, I made the comment that I think this is probably one of the 10 best films I've seen in the last couple of years. And that includes a lot of the Academy Award nominees because there's several of those that I wouldn't even put close to this.
Okay, well, hearing both of your thought processes did help me, and I think I'm gonna give it an 8 because I agree with you, Dana, in terms of like comedy. I feel like I have films that I've seen thousands of times that are just like funny or easy to put on comfort, but this film is something that I've shown to a lot of people, so I've watched it a lot of times, and yeah.
All right. So that ends at a 7.17 for our average score on that. And collectively, let's just quickly recap all of the categories. We had a 9 for legacy. We had a 9.33 for impact significance. We had an 8 for novelty. We had an 8.83 for classicness. We had a 7.17 for rewatchability. And then finally, we had a 95% on Google for their audience, 93% on Rotten Tomatoes for a 9.4 audience score overall. That brings us to a 51.73 and places it just inside or just outside the top 10, in between Silence of the Lambs and Apollo 13.
Wow.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought that when we started the week.
Yeah.
So, definitely an interesting conversation. Let's get to remaining questions and close everything out here. First one up. Why would Pia ever go back to Suhas in the present?
I honestly think that she was ready to marry this man, like fall in love, date this guy, and then he left. And I feel like just yeah, the timeline of probably what happened in those next 5 years, maybe she I don't like I feel like they don't really talk about if Pia ever tried to find him or like I think he contacted Millimeter and like brought him over to work for her, but like I think and it was the idiots who went and like scouted him out too. So I think she maybe she maybe just felt like ghosted and like and then just like went back to her old ways after this guy left her life.
I suppose that makes more rational sense that you retread old decisions after some level of trauma, but I don't know. After the guy's been proven to be an asshat, it would be strange for me to sign off on that. I thought it would have been a little bit easier if it had just been some no name, but it does add to the comedy of the whole wedding escape.
So tell me, is an ass hat a fedora, a derby, a top hat?
Any of those, as long as the crack is on the forehead. Yes, it has to be visible from the front. Either of you have any remaining questions?
What ultimately ended up happening to the school? Because obviously, there's a certain aspect where this engineering school, is it going to continue on in the same path after this level of destruction was levied on it?
Okay, so this is my lack of knowledge. I believe that the school, even though fictional, is supposed to have been set in New Delhi, although they don't necessarily refer to that.
They show the gateway of India in one of the scenes. So yes.
Okay. Now, I also don't know. I know that Southeast Asia often has monsoon seasons, but I don't, since it wasn't depicted at any other point in the film, if that's commonplace to that particular area. That's just a cultural gap as far as I'm concerned. But I would not be surprised if this was something that occurred every couple of years. If someone told me that, so I that's the one thing as far as trauma level. Personally, basically the only other remaining question I had was if Virus ever really let go of all of his animosity toward Rancho. Because even in the end, like, he gives him the space pen, but it still seems somewhat reluctant.
So sorry, I lied. The Gateway of India is actually in Mumbai, and I actually don't know what city the college was meant to be in, but I did want to point out that the cities that they visited, like Shimla, and like when they were going on the road trip to on the mountains and stuff, and even like where the school was, I feel like those are both very beautifully selected places because the geography you see like when in the last scene with the water and everything. And also, yeah, monsoon season is like in my head, I feel like there it's always monsoons. Like in the summer, it's raining pretty universally in India, but I have never been to like some parts of it.
Any other remaining questions?
No,
All right, let's wrap this up then. Dad, any final thoughts for the week?
no, I'm good. I loved the opportunity to stretch.
I will say one small thing, just in recognition of our. I don't know if this is probably not the right term, but our namesake for the company. It would be the recognition of my grandfather's birthday coming up this next week, when just after this. Well, it would be just before this episode is supposed to release, and given that our company and our appreciation of movies and sports and everything that we've done so far is in honor of him in many ways, just a recognition that is going on next week.
Yep, he would have been 81. And on his behalf, all those listeners, if you're smoking, stop. If you're not smoking, don't start. I mean, ultimately, 40 years of 2 packs a day does end up in some serious health issues.
Not to make a poor transition, but Saloni, if anyone wanted to find you or hear anything that you've got going on, find your Instagram or your TikTok stardom, where might they find you on? I think it's called social media. Is that right?
Yes, thank you. It would be at SUHHHLONI. So Saloni.
Very cool. And is that your handle for both?
Yep.
So thank you very much for being on. I know that we both appreciated the movie and you as a guest.
Yes, thank you. I had a good time.
Well, this is my life. It always will be. There's nothing else. Just us and the microphones. And those wonderful people out there in the dark. All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up. Next week, we'll be covering the mid-2000s hit comedy Wedding Crashers, starring Owen Wilson, Vince Vaughn, Rachel McAdams, and Ela Fisher. You won't want to miss that one, so check out realgood.com or Reelgood app. Again, REELGOOD, to find where it's streaming for you. Please like, follow, rate, and review, or whatever on whichever platform you have so that you can join in on our fun. You can also email the show at greatestalltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. Find us on Instagram at GMOTepodcast, or find Dana or I on Twitter at TJ3Duncan or at Dana W. Duncan. The Greatest Movie of All Time is a production of Ronnie Duncan Studios. Our show is mixed, edited, and written by Thomas Duncan. Our music is thanks to Purple Planet Music. Our technical provider and distributor is Captivate FM.